The first time Hannah saw a man's skin split beneath a whip, the image carved itself into her memory as sharply as the lash carved the man's back. She was only 7, a child with wide eyes and hands too small to shield her face. The summer air hung heavy, thick with the scent of tobacco curing in barns, but all she could smell was sweat and blood. The yard of Willow Creek plantation stretched out before her, a cruel stage. The overseer, newly hired and eager to prove his worth, swung the whip with methodical precision. Each strike echoed like thunder, followed by a hissins as leather peeled flesh. The man tied to the post, a field hand who had collapsed in the rows earlier that day, did not cry out after the third lash. His silence made the punishment feel heavier, as if every stroke fell on the backs of those who watched. Hannah's mother tried to cover her daughter's eyes, but Mistress Elellanena Blackwell's voice, cold and clear, cut through the crowd. Let the girl watch. She must learn her place. Her pale face, framed by auburn hair and a gown of green silk, betrayed no trace of pity. To Elellanena, this was instruction, not cruelty. Hannah clutched her dress tighter, the coarse fabric scratching her palms. The screams, the smell, the sight of torn flesh, these were her lessons. She did not yet understand what her place meant, but she understood that power could be displayed in the ruin of another's body. Lillian, Hannah's life at Willow Creek, had been inscribed before she could form words. She was born during a violent summer storm, lightning splitting an ancient oak that loomed near the gray house. The older slaves whispered it was an omen, but to the Blackwells it was nothing more than another entry in their ledger. Property added to the estate. The infant was swaddled not in lace but in scraps of cloth, placed in the arms of her exhausted mother in a cramped cabin where rain dripped through the roof. From that moment, Hannah belonged to the Blackwells as much as the silver tea service that gleamed on the dining table, or the mahogany chairs shipped from England. By the age of 10, she was deemed too delicate for the fields. Instead, she was brought into the great house, reassigned like furniture, to attend Mistress Elellanena. The mistress of Willow Creek was admired across Albemarle County for her beauty, green eyes, auburn hair, porcelain skin, but feared for her cruelty. Her household ran on precision and punishment. Nothing escaped her notice. Hannah quickly learned that a bowed head and lowered eyes were not merely manners, but survival. She polished shoes until her fingers ached, scrubbed floors until her knees bled, and fetched tea while standing so still she seemed carved from wood. In her young mind, she tried to keep count of every rule, but Elellanena shifted them like sand. What earned praise on Monday earned punishment on Tuesday. Her childhood became a ledger of tasks and slights. Each day another entry in a life recorded not by her own hand, but by her mistress's whims. Hannah's mornings began before the roosters crowed. Long before the first glow of dawn, she crept from her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, her breath puffing white in winter air or clinging heavy in summer's heat. The house demanded to be awakened gently. Fires coaxed to life in the hearth. Water, hauled and warmed for Mistress Elellena's ablutions, chamber pots emptied before the stench could drift toward delicate noses. Her feet grew calloused on the cold floors, her hands red raw from scrubbing, her back bent to sweep and polish, until the house gleamed like a mirror of its mistress. When the family stirred, Hannah had already completed hours of work. She carried breakfast trays balanced carefully, every step rehearsed to avoid the slightest tremor that might spill tea or porridge. Elellena's moods were storms with no forecast. One day, a hair arranged too tightly earned scorn. The next day, a loose curl was deemed negligence. Praise was rare, fleeting as a sunbeam. Punishment was constant, meted out in closets that smelled of damp earth, in the sting of a switch, in the gnaw of hunger when meals were withheld. But Hannah mastered silence. She learned to lock her thoughts behind a still face, to let her mind drift while her hands worked. She became both servant and observer, cataloging each cruelty, each contradiction. What seemed like submission was, in truth, survival written into muscle and bone. Alien, autumn of Echen Barbite Wusai brought with it a sharpness in the air, and with it, Elellena's temper grew sharper still. One morning, Hannah presented a freshly embroidered nightgown, stitches small and careful. She hoped, foolishly, that precision might shield her. But Elellena's green eyes narrowed at once. Worthless girl, the mistress spat, thrusting the fabric toward her. Even animals could do better. The silver-backed hairbrush in her hand glittered in the morning light. Hannah had seconds to brace before it arched through the air and struck her temple. Pain flared white. She turned her head just enough to keep skin from splitting, a skill learned through repetition. A thin line of blood welled near her hairline, sliding down her cheek. She willed her body still, her voice steady. "I will do better, mistress," Elellanena sneered. "Clean that up before it stains, then redo every stitch." Her lip curled, disdain deep as a blade. Hannah bent to wipe the drop of blood from the polished floor, her face hidden, her hands trembling only slightly. Inside, however, a different fire stirred. Each blow, each insult, became part of a ledger she carried silently. Every humiliation was a tally mark, not against herself, but against the woman who struck her. "Oh," she resumed, her stitching, her eyes lowered, her thoughts elsewhere. "Would band all." Counting the needle's passes became her secret refuge, each prick and pull a rhythm that dulled the pain. That promised one day she would be more than this moment, more than a body bent to another's cruelty. Hannah's mornings began before the roosters crowed. Long before the first glow of dawn, she crept from her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, her breath puffing white in winter air or clinging heavy in summer's heat. The house demanded to be awakened gently. Fires coaxed to life in the hearth. Water, hauled and warmed for Mistress Elellena's ablutions, chamber pots emptied before the stench could drift toward delicate noses. Her feet grew calloused on the cold floors, her hands red raw from scrubbing, her back bent to sweep and polish, until the house gleamed like a mirror of its mistress. When the family stirred, Hannah had already completed hours of work. She carried breakfast trays balanced carefully, every step rehearsed to avoid the slightest tremor that might spill tea or porridge. Elellena's moods were storms with no forecast. One day, a hair arranged too tightly earned scorn. The next day, a loose curl was deemed negligence. Praise was rare, fleeting as a sunbeam. Punishment was constant, meted out in closets that smelled of damp earth. In the sting of a switch, in the gnaw of hunger when meals were withheld. But Hannah mastered silence. She learned to lock her thoughts behind a still face, to let her mind drift while her hands worked. She became both servant and observer, cataloging each cruelty, each contradiction. What seemed like submission was, in truth, survival written into muscle and bone. Alien, autumn of Echen Barbite Wusai brought with it a sharpness in the air, and with it, Elellena's temper grew sharper still. One morning, Hannah presented a freshly embroidered nightgown, stitches small and careful. She hoped, foolishly, that precision might shield her. But Elellena's green eyes narrowed at once. Worthless girl, the mistress spat, thrusting the fabric toward her. Even animals could do better. The silver-backed hairbrush in her hand glittered in the morning light. Hannah had seconds to brace before it arched through the air and struck her temple. Pain flared white. She turned her head just enough to keep skin from splitting, a skill learned through repetition. A thin line of blood welled near her hairline, sliding down her cheek. She willed her body still, her voice steady. "I will do better, mistress," Elellanena sneered. "Clean that up before it stains, then redo every stitch." Her lip curled, disdain deep as a blade. Hannah bent to wipe the drop of blood from the polished floor, her face hidden, her hands trembling only slightly. Inside, however, a different fire stirred. Each blow, each insult, became part of a ledger she carried silently. Every humiliation was a tally mark, not against herself, but against the woman who struck her. Oh, she resumed, her stitching, her eyes lowered, her thoughts elsewhere. Would band all, counting the needle's passes became her secret refuge, each prick and pull a rhythm that dulled the pain. That promised one day she would be more than this moment, more than a body bent to another's cruelty. The first time Hannah truly saw Elijah was not with her eyes, but with her heart. She had known him since childhood in passing, his steady presence. When Master Blackwell demanded repairs or new furnishings from the Patterson plantation. But at 16, Hannah noticed the way his dark eyes softened whenever they found her, how his movements carried dignity, even in chains of servitude. One humid June evening, Hannah slipped into the old tobacco shed where Elijah worked. The air was thick with sawdust and the resinous scent of cut wood. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, his broad shoulders glistening with sweat, his expression warming at once. You shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing toward the door, though he set his tools aside. "Oh?" "I brought you water," Hannah replied, producing a small tin cup hidden in her apron. Their fingers brushed when he accepted it, and she nearly gasped at the unfamiliar flutter in her chest. Thank you," Elijah said softly. His gaze lingered, searching. "Are you well?" "I saw the mistress was in one of her moods today." Hannah's hand rose instinctively to her temple, where a faint bruise had begun to bloom. "I am accustomed to her ways." His jaw tightened. No one should be accustomed to such things. For a few precious minutes, they spoke of nothing and everything. The weather, the foal in the stables, the smallest fragments of normalcy. When Hannah turned to leave, Elijah pressed something into her palm, a small wooden bird exquisitely carved. "To remind you," he murmured, "that not everything beautiful is caged forever." Alien to Dalian. 2 days later, Hannah's fragile treasure was discovered. She entered Elellena's chamber and froze. The mistress stood poised before the fireplace. The wooden bird balanced delicately between her manicured fingers. "What is this primitive thing?" Elellanena asked, her tone deceptively soft. "And why was it hidden in your sleeping place? Has someone been giving my property gifts?" Hannah's world tilted. Her throat went dry, her eyes locked on the small carving. "It is nothing, mistress. A trifle I found lies." Elellena's smile was thin, triumphant. "I saw you with that Patterson carpenter. Did he make this for you? Do you fancy yourself in love, girl?" Hannah remained silent, her composure straining. "Perhaps you need a reminder of what you are." Elellanena crossed to the hearth, the bird dangling like prey. She held it over the flame. Hannah stepped forward despite herself, voice breaking. "Please, mistress." The mistress' lips curved upward as she released her fingers. The wooden bird fell into the fire. Its wings blackened, curled, and finally disintegrated in the blaze. The scent of burning wood filled the chamber. Hannah's mask cracked, just enough for grief to flicker through before hardening into something darker. The last fragile piece of her innocence withered with the bird's wings. Elellanena turned away, satisfied. But Hannah remained by the fire a moment longer, watching the ashes scatter upward like sparks. She did not cry. Instead, something sharp and enduring settled in her chest, glowing hotter than grief, hatred, forged in fire. 2 days after Elijah had given her the carved bird, Hannah's secret was uncovered. Mistress Elellanena found a folded slip of paper hidden under the floorboard of Hannah's closet. The words were simple, hopeful phrases of comfort, a promise that someday they might walk into freedom together. Elellena's cold eyes glittered as she read. She carried the note to her husband, dressing it not as an innocent exchange but as a threat, a plot of betrayal. "She has been compromised," Elellanena declared, her voice sharp with performance. "That Patterson boy was planning to steal her away." The master listened, weary but swayed, for his wife's anger demanded blood. The note became evidence. What was truly a promise of love became, in the mistress's telling, an act of rebellion. That night, Hannah overheard them speaking. Her breath caught when she realized the consequence would fall not only on her, but on Elijah. She pressed her palms against the wood of her small room, trembling as the weight of discovery settled like iron upon her chest. By morning, the yard of Willow Creek was arranged as a stage for fear. Slaves were summoned from fields and kitchens to witness what the master called a lesson. Hannah stood among them, her pulse racing, her throat dry. Elijah was dragged forward. He did not resist. His shoulders were squared, though his body bore the marks of endless labor. Hannah's heart ached to run to him, to shield him, but she could not move. The master's voice carried, "This is what happens when property forgets its place." The words rang across the yard, echoing louder than any strike could. Hannah's fingernails cut into her palms as she stood frozen, unable to speak. Tears pressed against her eyes, but she kept her face a mask. Any slip, any outcry could condemn her beside her. Elellena's hand seized her arm. The mistress leaned close, whispering with venom, "Your place is in the house. Unless you'd like to join him." That grip, that whisper, seared deeper than the spectacle itself. Lalian, that evening, the cruelty took on another shape. As Hannah brushed Elena's gleaming auburn hair, the mistress's mood was light. She spoke of Elijah's punishment with the same tone she used for choosing fabrics. "I've told Thaddeus to sell him south," she said, smiling faintly at her reflection in the mirror. "There's a buyer in Carolina. Hard work, harder fever. He won't last long." Hannah's hand paused on the brush before resuming, each stroke deliberate, steady. A storm raged inside her, but her face remained still. Her silence was her shield, but tonight it felt more like a chain. Elena prattled on, unaware of how each word drove a blade deeper into Hannah's chest. Elijah was being sent to a place designed to erase men, to break them faster than tobacco fields ever could. As the mistress spoke, Hannah felt something shift within her. Her grief hardened into resolve. The strokes of the brush became a rhythm, a vow in motion. That night, lying alone in her narrow closet, she touched the loose board where once she had hidden the wooden bird. The space was empty now, but within her chest something new took root. Not submission, not endurance, vengeance. The announcement came like a hammer blow. At supper, while Hannah served duck and poured wine, Master Blackwell cleared his throat. "The buyer's agent from Carolina arrives tomorrow. Elijah and 2 others will be collected at dawn." The words made Hannah's knees weaken, though she kept her tray steady. She had thought there would be more time. A week, perhaps 2. Instead, her last hope was being ripped away overnight. Elena's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "So soon?" she said, cutting delicately into her roast. "I had thought the Carolina gentleman wasn't expected until next week." An opportunity arose, Thaddeus muttered, refusing to meet his wife's gaze. Hannah recognized the shift in his tone, the evasiveness that spoke of mounting debts and desperate bargains. She moved through the rest of dinner in a haze, her hands performing their duties while her mind roared. Elijah, wounded, barely able to stand, was to be thrown into the hell of a rice plantation where even the strongest rarely survived the first year. Later, as she prepared Elellanena for bed, Hannah's mask held firm, but inside, grief and rage churned together. At her pallet that night, she lay awake tracing the loose floorboard, where once she had hidden Elijah's bird. In its place rested a small stone he had given her years before. She closed her fingers around it, as if drawing strength, and in the stillness, she began to imagine what could be done with herbs, with oil, with fire. Lalian, that night Hannah did not return to her pallet. Instead, She slipped quietly into the garden, the moonlight silvering her path. The kitchen plots grew both food and medicine, sage for sore throats, mint for fevers, lavender for sleep. Old Bessie, the cook, had taught the girls which leaves healed and which burned. Hannah's fingers moved with care, plucking sprigs and berries, sorting them by touch. Some eased pain. Others, Bessie warned, could still a heart if brewed too strong. Hannah wrapped them in cloth, her heart steady in her chest. She remembered Elijah's fevered words in the tobacco barn, rumors of men in Richmond who guided runaways north, of paths to freedom hidden in plain sight. But Elijah was being sent away. If she could not follow him, she would honor him another way, by ending the hand that tore them apart. Each leaf she gathered whispered a promise. She had been taught to bend like a reed under Elellenena's storms, to endure. But reeds bent too far would break. Tonight, in the hush of the garden, she chose not to bend. No. When she returned to her closet, she laid the bundles beneath the loose floorboard with the stone. As though making an altar, she pressed her palm to the wood and closed her eyes. A seed of vengeance had been planted, and it was already taking root. Over the following days, Hannah became a shadow with purpose. By night, she spread scraps of paper on the rough kitchen table, sketching the shape of the great house from memory. Her charcoal lines marked windows, doorways, the path of the night watchman, the places where servants lingered late. She noted which rooms lay empty after dark, which staircases creaked, which doorways stood unlocked. She recorded when Master Blackwell stumbled drunken to his study, when Elellanena retired with her powders and draughts. Her eyes, trained by years of servitude, saw patterns where others saw routine. She had brushed every curtain, polished every floorboard, lit every hearth. She knew where lamp oil was stored, how long it took flames to crawl from linen to timber, which hallway drafts might fan a blaze. By day she remained dutiful, polishing, fetching, bowing. By night her mind sharpened each observation into a blade. Every insult, every slap became fuel. She did not yet know when she would strike. But the plan was no longer a wild thought in the dark. It was ink on paper, oil in jars, herbs drying beneath her floorboard. She rehearsed in silence, each task a step closer to fire. And as she drew her final line across the paper, she whispered Elijah's name, not in despair, but in promise. 10 days after Elijah's departure, opportunity arrived, cloaked in ordinary routine. That morning, Elellanena announced, "Your master will dine with the planters in town. He'll not return till tomorrow." Her voice was smug, pleased at the chance for uninterrupted sleep. "You will attend me thoroughly tonight. I expect rest without disturbance." Hannah lowered her eyes. "Yes, mistress." Inside, a spark flared. With Thaddeus absent, there would be no interference. That evening, she prepared Elellenena's bath with unusual care. Rose petals floated in scented water. Silk towels warmed near the fire. She laid out the mistress's finest gown, embroidered with pearls, brushed her auburn hair until it shone like molten copper. "You're unusually attentive," Elellanena remarked suspiciously. "What mischief are you planning?" "No mischief. No mischief, mistress. Only service." Hannah's voice was soft, steady. When the tea was poured, she added 4 drops from the blue bottle. Elena grimaced at the taste but drained the cup. Within minutes her words slurred, her movements slowed. "Help me to bed," she murmured, yawning. Hannah obeyed, arranging the pillows, tucking the coverlet neatly. She banked the fire as ordered, though in truth she left the coals glowing beneath the ash. When she curtsied and withdrew, her heart pounded not with fear, but with certainty. Tonight, the seed planted in the garden would bear fruit in flame. Lallian. Hours passed before the house settled into its nocturnal silence. At 11, the watchman paused in the kitchen for his cider. As he always did, Hannah slipped from her closet, plain garments clinging to her frame, a bundle of supplies clutched to her chest. The great house loomed around her, familiar yet alien in its sleeping quiet. She moved like a shadow, every creak avoided, every step rehearsed. In Elellenena's chamber, the mistress slept deeply, her breath slow, her lips parted. Hannah set to work with steady hands. She coaxed the coals in the fireplace back to life, then laid strips of linen, soaked in lamp oil, across the floor. She draped them over the damask curtains, looped them toward the canopied bed. Each piece was placed with precision, like notes in a grim symphony. From the mantel she lit a taper. Flame leapt eagerly to the first rag. Fire raced, hissing along the path, climbing fabric, devouring air. The curtains flared, a violent bloom of orange. Heat swelled, pressing against her skin. Only when the flames reached the canopy did Elellanena stir. Her eyes flew open in confusion. Then terror. "What? Fire!" "Help!" she gasped, her voice swallowed by the roaring inferno. Hannah stood in the doorway, face illuminated by firelight, her voice steady. "Not anymore. I belong to myself." Hannah did not wait to see the end. The door closed behind her, muttering Elellenena's screams to muffled cries. She hurried down the back stairs, her bundle secure, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. In the kitchen she retrieved bread, cheese, a water skin, and the small knife she had hidden. Smoke already curled through the rafters, seeping from the east wing. Outside, voices began to shout, "Fire! Fire!" as orange light flickered against the dark sky. She slipped into the night, circling wide around the commotion, keeping to shadows as she had done her whole life. Behind her, the great house glowed like a lantern of destruction, flames clawing toward the heavens. Figures scurried below, buckets in hand, shouting orders drowned by the roar. At the edge of the tobacco fields, Hannah turned once more. The mansion that had caged her burned brilliantly, collapsing inward, as sparks showered upward like stars. It was beautiful in its ruin, terrible and righteous. Then she turned her back. Each step carried her further into the unknown, toward the woods, the rivers, the chance of freedom. Fear mingled with exhilaration, but she did not falter. No. For the first time in her life, she was not walking toward service. She was walking toward herself. Dawn broke in crimson and gold as Hannah crouched deep in a thicket of Virginia pines. She had traveled through the night, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her dress smudged with soot and torn from the brambles. 7 miles now separated her from Willow Creek, though the scent of smoke seemed to cling to her still. Her feet, clad only in thin cloth shoes, were blistered and bleeding. Every muscle ached, but she forced herself onward. Each mile was another chain broken, another breath of her own. She nibbled at bread and cheese, sipping sparingly from her water skin. The food was already half gone. Panic pressed at her edges, but so did determination. The sound of hoofbeats cracked the air. Hannah flattened against the damp ground, her body pressed to the earth as 4 riders thundered past on the road. Their voices carried, "Find the girl. She'll be heading north." Her heart hammered. She held her breath, mud smearing her cheek until the echoes faded. She knew their eyes searched for a solitary figure moving northward. They expected predictability. That was her advantage. As the last rider vanished, Hannah exhaled slowly. She would not go north, not yet. She would go east, toward the water, toward the coast, where Elijah once spoke of sailors who hid fugitives. It was a longer path, more dangerous, but less expected, and Hannah had learned that underestimation was her shield. For 3 days, Hannah moved like a ghost through Virginia's countryside. She traveled mostly by night, guided by stars. Elijah had once taught her to read. By day she hid in abandoned barns, hollowed trees, or root cellars forgotten by time. Hunger gnawed at her belly. Her provisions dwindled to nothing but desperation and roots. She foraged from stream banks. On the fourth day, weakened and shivering, she stumbled upon a ruined cabin deep in the woods. Its roof sagged, its walls blanketed with vines. Yet inside, she found treasures that felt like salvation. A moldy blanket, a rusted knife, and, most precious, a man's shirt and trousers hanging from a peg. Hannah stripped her dress away, binding her chest with torn fabric. She hacked her hair short with the knife, mudding her skin darker to obscure her features. When she studied herself in a cracked bit of mirror, she barely recognized the boy staring back. The disguise gave her confidence. Twice she encountered white travelers. Instead of hiding, she lowered her gaze, shoulders hunched in feigned deference. They spared her only a glance, seeing not a fugitive's girl, but a weary field hand. That night, wrapped in the borrowed clothes and the moldy blanket, Hannah felt her fear ease slightly. She was no longer simply Hannah, the servant girl. She was a shadow, a survivor, moving toward freedom by wit and will. By the sixth night, the weather turned against her. Rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking her thin clothes and turning the ground to sucking mud. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning splitting the sky into jagged shards of light. Hannah pressed on, each step an act of will. The rain, though miserable, offered cover, masking her tracks, drowning out her movements. She followed the banks of a stream that widened into a river, its waters churning under the storm. It was during one lightning flash that she saw it, a small skiff tied to a crude dock. She hesitated, scanning the darkness for signs of its owner. None came. With trembling hands, she untied the rope and climbed aboard. The boat rocked, threatening to spill her into the river, but she gripped the oars and pushed away from shore. She had never rowed alone, but she had watched men at Willow Creek steer river craft. The storm cloaked her clumsiness, rain hammered her shoulders, wind stung her face, but the current carried her swiftly eastward. By dawn, her arms quivered with exhaustion, her palms blistered anew. She guided the boat into a willow-draped inlet, tying it clumsily before collapsing beneath the branches. She slept deeply, dreamless, for the first time since the fire. The morning after the storm, Hannah woke to voices drifting across the water. At first, she thought it was a dream, but then the words sharpened. Check both sides of the river. That boat didn't drift off by itself. She froze beneath the willow branches, her body stiff with fear. Through the shifting curtain of leaves, she glimpsed men on horseback along the opposite bank, their coats damp, their dogs straining at leashes. You think it's the Blackwell girl?" one man asked. "Could be," another answered grimly. Disguises match what the peddler saw, heading east instead of north. Clever girl, but not clever enough. Hannah's heart pounded so loud, she feared it would betray her. Slowly, she pressed herself deeper into the mud, the earth cold against her skin. She dared not swat at the flies crawling on her face, dared not breathe too loud. The men moved along the shore, scanning the water, pointing downstream where the current bent around cypress trees. Minutes stretched into hours as Hannah remained motionless, her limbs cramping. Only when the voices faded into distance did she allow herself to breathe. The boat was no longer safety. It was evidence. She abandoned it, stepping carefully into the shallows. Each stride upstream erased her trail, the cool water soothing her blistered feet. For the first time since leaving Willow Creek, she realized they were not simply hunting an escaped slave. They were hunting her, Zalian. The hours that followed tested Hannah more than the lash ever had. She crouched beneath the willows until her muscles screamed. The sun climbed high, baking her into stillness, drying the mud on her skin into a stiff mask. Insects buzzed relentlessly, crawling over her hands and neck, but she remained still. The faint bark of dogs echoed now and then, reminding her that pursuit had not ceased. When the shadows finally lengthened, Hannah eased from her hiding place, each movement deliberate. She waded upstream, letting the water disguise her footprints. The current tugged at her legs, cool and strong, but she welcomed it. Each step carried her further from those who hunted her. Night fell before she allowed herself to rest. She lay in a patch of reeds, her body curled against the earth, stomach growling with hunger. Sleep came in fractured pieces, each dream snapping into panic at imagined footsteps. She thought of Elijah, of his words in the barn. There are ways out. Those words clung to her now, fragile and precious. Hannah pressed her palm to the smooth stone hidden in her pocket, grounding herself in memory. She could not falter. She would not be caught. Lie on for 2 more days, Hannah pressed eastward. Food had run out, her stomach gnawed by emptiness, but she scavenged berries and chewed cattail roots. Each mile drained her, yet each mile also lifted her. The plantations gave way to wetlands, then to open air that smelled faintly of salt. By the 9th night, she crested her eyes and saw it. The vast, silvery sweep of the Chesapeake Bay shimmering under moonlight. The sight nearly brought her to her knees. She had dreamed of this, water wide enough to carry her far from Virginia's grip. She stumbled down toward the shoreline, her body aching but her spirit built. Along the horizon twinkled the lanterns of a small fishing settlement. From the cover of trees, she watched men unloading nets at the docks, black and white sailors working side by side. Here was possibility. Here was risk. If she approached the wrong man, she could be dragged back in chains. But if she chose right, perhaps she could vanish onto the water, carried northward into the promise Elijah once described. The wind off, the bay smelled of brine and freedom. For the first time since she lit the fire, Hannah allowed herself to whisper aloud. Almost, exhaustion nearly claimed Hannah before safety did. She stumbled through marshy woods near the bay until she found what, at first, seemed like a pile of timber, swallowed by ivy. But closer inspection revealed a cabin, half collapsed, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Inside the air smelled of damp wood and decay, but it was shelter. Sunlight slanted through broken boards, illuminating relics left behind. A rusted pot, a splintered chair, and, most valuable of all, a coarse wool blanket hanging from a nail. Hannah wrapped herself in it, shivering as the dampness seeped from her bones. She explored further and discovered a knife left, forgotten in the dirt, its handle worn smooth. She tested the blade against her palm. It was crude but serviceable. Then, hanging on a peg, she found what made her heart lurch. An old shirt and trousers, stiff with dust but intact. She changed quickly, discarding the tattered dress she had worn since Willow Creek. She bound her breasts with strips of cloth, cut her hair shorter still, and smeared her skin with mud until her reflection in a cracked shard of mirror was that of a weary young boy. That night, curled on the cabin's floor, she allowed herself to sleep deeply. The storm of pursuit still raged in her memory, but here, in this ruin reclaimed by nature, she had found the smallest piece of sanctuary. The disguise became more than fabric. It became armor. Hannah studied herself in the mirror shard, hardly recognizing the boyish figure staring back. Shoulders hunched, hair unevenly cropped, skin darkened with mud. She was no longer Elelena's servant girl. Twice, in the following days, she tested this new self. On a narrow country road, she encountered 2 white farmers hauling timber. Heart hammering, she lowered her head, stepped aside, and mumbled a deferential sir. They barely glanced at her before moving on. Relief nearly made her collapse. The disguise offered freedom of movement. No longer bound to shadows, she walked roads in daylight, blending with laborers. She kept her pace slow, her eyes cast downward, but inside her chest, her pulse raced with the thrill of invisibility. Yet with each step eastward, hunger gnawed deeper. Her blanket and food were gone, her shoes little more than cloth strips tied around bleeding feet. Still, the disguise bought her time, and time was survival. At night, she whispered her name, Hannah, to the darkness, reminding herself she had not vanished entirely. By day, She wore the mask of a nameless boy. Between the two, she inched closer to freedom. Nolian. The disguise was tested further when Hannah reached the outskirts of the fishing settlement. The air was thick with brine, gulls crying overhead. Docks stretched into the bay, boats bobbing gently, lanterns swaying in the morning breeze. Oh, she straightened her shoulders, mimicking the gait of the dockhands. She lifted coils of rope left on the planks, moving as though she belonged. Her heart pounded with every glance, but no one challenged her. The illusion held. "You, boy!" a gruff voice called. Hannah froze, then turned. An older black sailor stood on the deck of a small sloop, his weathered face sharp with suspicion. His gray-streaked hair caught the dawn light. "I don't know you," he said. "Who you work for?" "Looking for work," she whispered, lowering her eyes. The man studied her clothes, her posture, the rawness of her feet. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Come aboard. Nets need mending." Hannah's breath caught. It was a test, she realized, but also an opening. She stepped onto the boat, her legs nearly giving way as the deck shifted beneath her. For the first time since Willow Creek burned, she felt not hunted, but hidden. The older sailor led Hannah into the small cabin of his sloop. The wooden walls smelled of tar, fish, and salt. He shut the door behind them, the lamplight flickering across his weathered face. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, studied her in silence. "You, the Blackwell girl," he said at last. His tone wasn't a question, it was certainty. Hannah's breath caught, every muscle tensing. If he shouted, if he summoned others, she was lost. She edged toward the door, ready to bolt. But Jacob Williams raised a calming hand. "I ain't in the slave-catching business. Got my freedom papers 20 years back. Been helping others find theirs since." The weight of his words sank into her. Her disguise, her silence, her fear, he had seen through them in a glance. Yet instead of chains, he offered understanding. "They saying, 'You killed your mistress,'" Jacob continued, his eyes steady. "Burned her alive in her bed." Hannah's voice broke into the space between them, low but fierce. She deserved it. For a long moment, Jacob neither condemned nor praised. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Maybe so. Ain't my place to judge. But girl, you lit more than a house. You lit a hunt that won't end. They'll be after you now, not just for running, but for rebellion." Hannah swallowed hard. She already knew. But hearing it aloud made the danger feel endless. Jacob leaned against the cabin wall, arms folded. "There's talk all up and down the bay. $50 reward for the Blackwell girl. Slave catchers, patrols, planters, every last one's hungry for the bounty." Hannah's chest tightened. "I can't stop now. I have to find Elijah. They sold him south, to the rice fields." Jacob's expression darkened. "Carolina." He shook his head slowly. "That's death, child. Swamps, fever, work that breaks the strongest in months. And with your face on every tongue, you'd never get near." Tears pricked Hannah's eyes, but she blinked them back. "He's the only one who ever saw me as more than property." The sailor's voice softened, though his words cut sharp. "I understand about love, but sometimes survival has to come first. Dead heroes don't free nobody." Silence pressed between them. Hannah's mind churned. The fire she set had been vengeance. Yes, but it had also been defiance, a strike against the system itself. Couldn't she fight better if she lived, if she found a way north? Jacob seemed to read her struggle. "There's a vessel leaving for Boston tonight. Captain's a Quaker, man of a principle. Don't believe in slavery. He's carried souls like you before. From Boston, you could reach Canada. True freedom. No chains, no catchers." The words painted a horizon Hannah had barely dared to imagine. Safety, survival, yet it meant turning from Elijah. The tide of decision rose inside Hannah. Jacob's words echoed. "Live and find ways to fight. The fire at Willow Creek had been her first strike. Perhaps freedom itself could be the second. When does the ship leave? She asked, finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Midnight? High tide, Jacob replied. I'll hide you till then and get word to the captain. He paused, his gaze narrowing thoughtfully. But child, you'll need more than rags and courage where you're going. You'll need a new name. Best to leave Hannah behind. Hannah hesitated. Her whole life, her name had been called in command, in punishment, in cruelty. Anna belonged to the lash, to Elellena's sneer, to Willow Creek's shadow. She thought of fire, of Elijah's carved bird turned to ash, of the smooth stone in her pocket, cool and grounding, of the endless horizon now opening before her. Liberty, she whispered. The word felt strange, powerful, alive on her tongue. My name is Liberty. Jacob's weathered face softened into a faint smile. Then Liberty you'll be. Rest now. Tonight, you begin the journey to become who you were meant to be. You, as darkness fell, Hannah, no, Liberty, stood on the deck of the Quaker vessel, the Virginia shoreline shrinking behind her. The salt wind filled her lungs, carrying away the smoke she thought would never leave her skin. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the unclaimed promise of freedom. Boston smelled of coal smoke and salt water, its streets alive with clattering carriages and voices from every corner of the world. Liberty stepped off the Quaker ship with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fire in her heart. She worked first as a seamstress, her nimble fingers stitching fabric in a small shop owned by an abolitionist woman. The pay was meager, but it was hers, earned, not stolen by another's hand. For the first time, Liberty bought her own bread. She chose where to walk. No one struck her for speaking too slow or stitching too unevenly. At night she attended meetings of abolitionists, listening in silence as speakers thundered against slavery. When she dared to speak, her voice trembled but carried truth. I have seen the lash break bodies. I have seen love burn to ash, and I have seen the fire of resistance. Faces turned toward her, eyes wide. Her testimony was more powerful than any pamphlet. Though she searched tirelessly, Elijah's name never appeared on escape lists or whispered networks. Each failure tore at her, but she carried him still, a living ember inside. She told herself he would want her to live, to fight, to carry their shared dream north. By Ichinbabaiwusisan, Liberty crossed into Canada, stepping onto Toronto's cobbled streets with papers in her pocket, declaring her free. The moment her feet touched Canadian soil, she wept. Not just for herself, but for all who could not cross with her. Lash in Toronto was colder than Virginia, but Liberty found warmth in the community of freedmen and women who gathered in parlors, churches, and small halls. They organized meetings, printed handbills, and raised money for those still enslaved. Liberty became known not for her sewing, but for her story. She stood before audiences, sometimes trembling, sometimes fiery, and spoke of Willow Creek, of Elellena's cruelty, of Elijah's scars, of the fire that devoured the house of her torment. I was once property, she told them, but I chose fire, I chose flight, and I chose to live. Her words carried weight, each syllable carved from survival. She joined the Canadian Anti-Slavery Society, writing letters to newspapers, sewing banners for marches, teaching younger fugitives how to read and stitch so they might support themselves. Her hands, once forced to embroider gowns for a mistress, now stitched words of freedom into cloth that rippled in the northern wind. Though her heart still ached for Elijah, Liberty poured her love into the cause. In every speech, in every act of defiance, she carried his memory. His bird had burned, but its spirit had flown into her. Through decades of labor, Liberty became a fixture in the movement, a living reminder of the cost of bondage and the strength of resistance. Lalian, Liberty lived until Ichinbabaiwusisan, passing at the age of 62 in a small home outside Toronto. By then, slavery had been abolished in the United States, but the scars of its cruelty remained. Neighbors and friends gathered at her burial, remembering not just the woman she had been, but the fire she had carried. Children, she once taught to read, now brought their own families to her grave, speaking of her as legend. Abolitionists who had marched beside her told newcomers of the woman who, had burned her mistress' house and walked north beneath the stars. Though she never found Elijah, his memory was etched into her every word and deed. In the end, her life was not defined by loss, but by defiance. She had turned the tools of her oppression, needle, cloth, silence, into weapons for freedom. Her headstone bore only her chosen name, Liberty. No mention of Willow Creek. No chains tied to memory, only the words she had claimed as her own. The story of Hannah, known as Liberty, echoed long after the last handful of earth covered her grave. Her defiance reminded generations that freedom was never simply granted. It was seized, fought for, sometimes in blood and fire.